Hello, this is video number 2 in my list of key philosophical texts. If you recall, the first video in this series was about Plato's Republic and some notes that I took while reading that. And this is going to be, the second video is going to be about the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. So the presentation, which is semi-formal just because it is based on some notes that I've taken, the presentation is divided into 4 parts. The first part is about method, Aristotle's method in this text. Second part will be about character, habits, and actions. The third part will be about friendship, and the last will be a concluding section. So let me begin with the first part on method. Aristotle is explicit about the way he goes about studying the subject matter of ethics. He offers instructions regarding how we should study this topic. For example, he notes that we should make sure not to let our philosophical study become subordinate to or fall into something else, another kind of project. So we might begin with a more ambitious project of trying to offer a general theory about ethics. But because that is very difficult, we might fall into solving an easier problem and forget about our original task. So instead, we might come up with a solution to a particular or subset of ethical problems. So to avoid that, we should keep in mind throughout the study what it is that we are aiming at and how the different topics that he's covering, they are all related to that, that central aim. What we are aiming at is a general understanding of good conduct or good life, but this is itself embedded necessarily in a broader study of the human person. With this text, we are not just asking, what should I do or how should I live, but what kind of creatures are we? And those two sets of questions are related to each other, and it is telling that these two are connected. That's part of the Aristotelian project, that what we are is deeply connected to what we ought to be or how we should conduct our lives. The descriptive project, in other words, is inseparable from the normative project. He also repeatedly states that the demand for precision has to be appropriate to the subject matter. That is part of the rigor with which we study a topic. So part of the rigor with which we are studying, part of the rigor in our approach is the match between how much precision we are demanding, we are going after, and what it is that we are studying, we are trying to understand. So it would be unrigorous to demand the same precision in the study of ethics or politics that we would demand in the study of geometry or physics. Why is it that the study of ethics or the study of human nature cannot be as precise as geometry or physics? Because the factors involved in our investigation are more numerous and changing. We are not dealing with physical constants, for example. Determining the appropriate action in a given situation requires inspecting that situation and deciding what is relevant in that context, in that situation. And given the complexity of human life, part of the situation, the relevant facts of the situation might themselves be perceived with imprecision, or be completely obscure in some cases, completely hidden from our view. If we demand absolute precision, we will end up with statements like, you cannot decide, so this is the kind of absurd statement that we might end up with as a result of demanding too much accuracy and precision. Statement like, you can't decide if a person is just or virtuous until they are dead. So technically, well, strictly speaking, that is correct, because as long as a person is alive, things might change. Anything is possible. But it's better to loosen our demand for precision such that we can judge, apply criteria of our judgment to living people, living individuals. In each of the topics considered, Aristotle catalogs types of situation or types of people or types of activity. And the term catalog for me is absolutely key in describing, it's very apt in describing what Aristotle does. He goes through a list with each topic and he catalogs these types of situation, types of people, types of activity. And he pays attention to a number of factors in each case that we should include in our judgments, in our categorization of that type. And he includes these factors, including how people talk, common opinion. How do people respond? How do people talk about, for example, lying, types of lying, types of ways in which somebody spends money, how we commonly emotionally react to a type of behavior. He also asks us to pay attention to our emotional reaction, how we feel about something. For example, how we respond to another person's happiness is something he notes. We don't praise someone for being happy or having good fortune, being lucky. We don't say, oh, good for you. We will call that person blessed. And being blessed is not praiseworthy. What is praiseworthy is virtue, not general happiness and good fortune. Similarly, in another example, we read that what is worth praising is not just a right act, but the state of mind that results in that correct action. And thus, the adjective virtuous is given to states of mind as well as the individuals or actions. He also uses as another source, another factor in our consideration, sometimes quotes by other philosophers, some wise quotes. For example, he talks about Anaxagoras, who has said, and I'm paraphrasing, it would be surprising it would not be surprising if a wise man or a truly happy man is perceived by most people as a strange person or as a weird individual, because most people will not be able to evaluate true wisdom or true happiness. So he quotes Anaxagoras as saying something to that effect, and he says that even though that makes sense, even though Anaxagoras might be correct in that statement, but we shouldn't take that as the basis of our judgment, but we should look at the facts of life and use the facts of life as the ultimate basis for our conclusions. So that's another important note on method. Although Aristotle considers all these domains, all these sources that help shape our judgments, guide our judgments, he doesn't make any one of them the main authority. The pieces that he is thinking with hang together like pieces of a puzzle without over-reliance on any one piece. So no one piece is the master of the entire puzzle. No one proposition is overly burdened. For example, when discussing what is socially pleasant, the characteristics that we find pleasant in social intercourse, including charm or wit, he talks about characters that we commonly judge to be pleasant and valuable. But he also criticizes public opinion in some places. In judging humor, for example, in deciding whether someone is witty, charming, he says that a buffoon, a silly person, might be viewed by many people, by a majority maybe, as a witty and charming person, though this is a reflection of the poor standards operative in public opinion. In short, he wants to train our attention and sharpen our intuition, to train us to pay attention and think in a non-simplistic way, to consider more of the possible factors involved in deliberation and in the formation of a judgment. So that was part 1. Let's now turn to part 2, which I have titled Character, Habit, and Action. There are, according to Aristotle, cyclical and mutually reinforcing relationships between actions, habits, and character. A habit is formed through repeating a type of action in a type of situation, like acting according to your principle in the face of danger, taking a risk. Why? Because you are enacting a principle you believe in, even though that enactment in that situation puts you at risk. This is a brave act, which reinforces the habit of acting bravely again in a similar situation. It makes it easier to do the same or perform a similar courageous act next time, which in turn results in the development and formation of a courageous character. One of the features of virtue, what makes it distinct from action, is that it is stable. The stability of virtue is something that we will return to on the topic of friendship. The point isn't only about deciding well, but getting to a place where you gain pleasure from doing the right thing and pain from doing the wrong thing. To have this moral training, early education is necessary. It isn't enough for a person to do one just act, but she ought to do so, to do the just act, as a just person. It would be helpful to point out that Aristotle divides the human soul into rational and irrational parts, and each part corresponds to a set of objects and activities. And the rational part is itself divided into the scientific part and a part concerned with deliberation and practical reasoning. Choosing and evaluating an action cannot be done with abstract thinking alone. It requires perception of particularity. Well, perception itself implies particularity. For instance, knowing whether one has deviated too much from the mean, for desired mean, for example, knowing whether at this moment in this party you are drinking too much, or maybe you should stop drinking, or you can drink a little bit more. That requires a perception that is operating in this instance. Actions, like people, individuals, are in the class of particulars. To perceive and judge whether an action is ethical, we need to know whether it is compulsory or voluntary. But not all voluntary acts reflect choice, because sometimes, even though an act is voluntary, it is done in the spur of the moment. For an act to be truly chosen, deliberation is required. Now, what is deliberation? Deliberation, according to Aristotle, is a type of investigation and is especially necessary when parts of the situation are initially hidden from our view. For example, you know what the goal is, but you're not sure which tool to use or which method to use, or whether this path will work as well as another path. This is the type of situation that require deliberation. Deliberation is a kind of investigation, but not all investigation is deliberation. But all deliberation is investigation. In contrast to scientific investigation, ethical deliberation issues command. It doesn't just give us information, but it demands from us an action. A wise person is skilled at deliberation, which is to say, good at responding to the demands of the current situation. Aristotle compares practical wisdom with art. Art also has to do with skill, mastery, with intention, and being a moving principle of action or construction or creation. Art and ethical deliberation both deal with variable factors, so a changing reality and adapting to that changing reality. In contrast, science, according to Aristotle, is concerned primarily with unchanging and invariable factors. Deliberation, therefore, is like navigation or search or calculation. Of course, deliberation can be used for evil too. Aristotle considers the statement that nobody voluntarily chooses to be unhappy or sick. Is this true? Is it true that nobody chooses to be unhappy or sick? Isn't it the case that some people act without regard to the consequences of their action? And the consequences are potentially available to them. They can think about those negative consequences. They can pay attention. Sometimes we do the wrong things not because the knowledge of right and wrong or good and bad consequences is unavailable, but because we don't think through the situation. We don't deliberate. We don't anticipate all the possible consequences. We discount, to use a more contemporary psychological term. We have things like temporal discounting. We discount what is available, and we don't let it affect our choice of action. Aristotle makes a fresh start at Book 7, and I love these fresh starts that he uses. He interjects by saying, let's go back to the beginning, to a beginning point. It's like a good teacher who wipes the blackboard to begin from another starting position. So at Book 7, that something like that happens, and he says, okay, let's begin by dividing things we should avoid, the moral states to be avoided. Let's divide them into three moral states to be avoided. First is vice, which means having evil aims, having evil goals. The second is incontinence, which is the inability to contain oneself, the inability to regulate, self-regulate, despite understanding and having good aims. And the third is brutishness. And brutishness means basically not being civil or having good manners. Incontinence is discussed at length because it is puzzling. How can someone who understands good and bad behavior justice and injustice, act unjustly. So having an understanding but not acting in accordance to that understanding. Seeking pleasure or avoiding discomfort is one main reason. Incontinence is, interestingly, uniquely human, according to Aristotle. Aristotle takes the case of incontinence to distinguish between true understanding of an insight, becoming one with the truth on the one hand, and being able to talk about the truth, which is a superficial understanding. Only being able to understand an insight, like an actor on the stage. So those two are different, should be distinguished, because one of them results in the phenomena of incontinence. So that was part 2. Part 3 is on friendship. Friendship also has to be understood in connection to our general understanding of the human person. A human person might engage in an activity because of several possible reasons. The activity might itself be pleasant because the activity serves in bringing about something pleasant, or because it is in accordance to a principle, to some principle, serving a higher good, or moving us toward the fulfillment of human life, happiness, virtue, and the like. So take, for example, the activity of meditation. People meditate for a different reason. Somebody might meditate because they take pleasure in meditating. Somebody else might meditate because of the outcome, the results, the consequences. For example, they say, it reduces my stress, or it has health benefits, or it makes me more present in my social interactions. Or somebody might meditate because it prepares them for better deliberation, better ethical decision-making, or better political engagement. Similarly, friendship could be based on pleasant qualities for its own sake, qualities that we pursue for their own sake. It could be based on utility, how a friend is useful for us for some other goal we have, or it could be based on virtue, which is the most stable character in a person. A friendship is most perfect if it is based on all of these three. It is pleasant, it has utility, and it is founded on virtue, mutual recognition and mutual respect. Gift economy naturally arises from these considerations. The idea of giving back what you can give, not what the other person demands from you. That's the essence of gift economy. Friendships of utility are full of complaints because each person wants to get at least as much as they give. The next point is about the relationship between types of friendship and types of community. A good political system is one in which, or a good community is one in which people can pursue virtuous activity, and that has the consequence of, if people are free to be virtuous, they can also detect virtue in each other, and then choose to live with other people who have similar virtues. People who are oppressed, they are living in an oppressed system. They are deprived of certain activities, certain pursuits, and thus cannot find those people who are engaged in those pursuits. So thus, friends cannot find friends based on those activities that are oppressed. A person's life is complete with friends. We live with friends, that is, we think with them, decide with them, and we rejoice or grieve with them together. So good friendship isn't only about discipline and cold calculation, about virtue. It is also about pleasure and utility. Pleasure in general, pleasure with regard to activities in general, is something that completes an activity. In other words, every activity culminates in its own kind of joy. Aristotle then asks a simple question: why don't we experience pleasure all the time? If pleasure is part of our activities, if pleasure is something that completes all activities, why is it that we are not experiencing pleasure all the time? I think the absence of enjoyment or pleasure is connected to the presence of desire or discontent, the striving towards completion and pleasure. We repeat an activity with a desire of having it complete this time, like how we study, write, or play an instrument with the hope and desire of having a good session, a good study session, writing session, or practice session. So while Aristotle emphasizes how an activity is completed with its enjoyment, we could also emphasize the meaningful incompleteness of activities, their striving character, the fact that they are striving because they are incomplete. That incompleteness drives them. Or their erotic character, what it is about them that signifies wanting to be connected, wanting to love, wanting to be loved. This theme is related to my next book review of folk phenomenology by Sam Rocha, so let me not get into that more. We have reached the last section, concluding remarks. Humanity is uniquely capable of reason and rationality. Humanity is unique in its capacity for reason. Reason and contemplation are the activities that are most proper to being human. Without them, human life wouldn't be complete. A complete human life will be engaged with reason and will take pleasure in reason. Aristotle ends the book by talking about the limits of his inquiry. Most people don't benefit from hearing about theories of ethics, he says. And the book isn't written for them. The book doesn't promise to provide moral training like a self-help book might. It is written for philosophers interested in an inquiry into ethics. It presupposes that certain requirements are already in place, including moral education. So this is the philosophizing on ethics is the icing on top. A lot of other things should have already happened. Moral training requires practical support from the environment throughout one's life. This includes a good upbringing, good education, good laws, good company, and friendship. Ethical theory can come later, providing the understanding of what we are engaged in. At the end, Aristotle, looks towards the art and practice of legislation, not only as a supporting discipline for ethics, but also as a complementary approach to studying human nature. So we could say the text ends with a reference to its own incompleteness and with the promise of another approach, politics and law, that would complement it. The book is an amazing place for thinking, for intellectual training, for training of our attention, training in the art of noticing what is relevant in a judgment. That means my summary, or any summary of this text, cannot be replaced with what we could experience and what we could get from reading it directly. That's it for my presentation, and I thank you for your attention.